Let's focus in a little bit now on an area that you've done a lot of reporting on too, which is Sudan. Sudan is currently facing a devastating humanitarian crisis as a raging civil war has left hundreds of thousands displaced, facing hunger and poverty. Can you explain how Western imperialist forces have shaped what is currently happening in Sudan?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking this. It's such a terrible conflict happening in Sudan, and I feel people know about it, but it's still not getting the coverage that it deserves. I mean, millions of people displaced, facing famine, hunger, and we don't even know really how many people have been killed. And like the numbers are so low, it's like not even logical. So the death toll is going to be, when it finally ends, I think catastrophic. So, it's an interesting thing about Sudan because to put Sudan in the correct context, we really have to go back and start in 2019 when the Bashir government was overthrown in Sudan. And, Sudan is a huge country, as people know. It was the largest country by land area for many years. I think it kind of actually remained that even after South Sudan separated in 2010. So it's a huge country, spans many different ethnic groups, different things like that. So you have this uprising that takes place in 2019 against the government. And there's many things you could say about the Bashir government. Certainly they were very much in favor of Palestine, but ultimately they were continuing a situation where Sudan was very divided, both sort of geographically and on a class-based basis as it concerns the great wealth of Sudan. And Sudan is a very wealthy country. People don't really know that about Sudan, but huge amount of gold there. Gum Arabic, which not a lot of people know about, but it's an important factor in a lot of foods, also comes from there. One of the major cattle producers is also coming from there. Big cotton production there in Sudan. So Sudan, a lot of money can be made in Sudan. There's no doubt about that. It's also geostrategically important. The Nile River passes through there, obviously. It's got one of the longer Red Sea borders, and we know the Red Sea is so crucial because of the Suez Canal. I forget the exact number, but a significant amount of global trade is flowing through there. So Sudan has a key geostrategic reality to it, which means that Sudan is very much in the center of geopolitics, even though it's rarely talked about in that way. But in Africa, it's one of the countries that historically, what happens in Sudan, a lot of things around the continent turn on Sudan. So in 2019, you had a situation where you had a combination of factors. Sudan historically, the sort of ruling elites tend to come from what are known in many places the riverine elite, people who live in areas around the Nile River. So you have an issue where the wealth in Sudan is heavily concentrated in Khartoum and other places that are more in the sort of direct Nile River. So you have in the eastern part of Sudan, the southern part of Sudan, the western part of Sudan, Darfur, which people know about, that kind of like geospatial inequality. Like the provinces that are further out tend to have their own elites or whatever, but they tend to have less access to money, less access to resources, despite a lot of resources and money being generated in those regions. So you've always had a lot of people who have felt the country needs to be significantly more equal from that perspective. And then you just have the difference between rich and poor that you have in the vast majority of countries on earth, that a huge amount of resources are being generated, but they're being controlled by a tiny elite. And then you have on top of that the fact that the political scene there was heavily constrained and there was not a lot of democratic space. So you had a combination of factors where Sudan, also a country that the vast majority of people are very young, you had this huge mass movement of people whose anger based on their own lack of resources, opportunity, and ability to really speak out on those things all came together at once in this huge movement of millions of people overthrows the government of Omar al-Bashir, the National Congress Party. They set up these things called revolutionary committees, these committees that they set up all over the country and all these different places that are run by young people. They're neighborhood-based committees, the RCs, and they're starting to push this new grassroots reality. They're putting together all of these various different plans, and their plans are notable, for ending the IMF and the World Bank regimes. They want to change that. They want to have a better distribution of wealth. They want to make sure that healthcare and education is already free in Sudan, but that those things are secured and well resourced and that they remain free. That basically like that the country would become significantly more equal economically. Then they also wanted to have more, sort of small democratic rights, and to have the ability for political parties to be more formed, for the media to be a little bit more open, different pieces like that. So, it looked like really a new wind, a new day coming into Sudan with the masses of people from many different political backgrounds agreeing at the very least, we need to change our government to make it more equal in terms of the socioeconomic factors and to make it more sort of small d democratic in terms of how the different political forces interact with each other. And so ultimately, what happens is this then becomes very scary to the West and to the Gulf states because their thought is like, whoa, wait a second here. A lot of interests are at stake. One, a democratic Sudan is guaranteed to continue to be very much in favor of Palestine. Like in Sudan, basically everyone is for Palestine. And, I remember talking to somebody in Khartoum or Omdurman, excuse me, which is right next to Khartoum, the capital, in the middle of the fighting in Omdurman. And they were actually congratulating me and for breakthrough news doing so much for Palestine. And I'm thinking like, what? This is wild. And I was like, man, like of everything going on, I appreciate you raising that and sending me this message. And they were like, look, Sudan, Palestine, same struggle, same fight. Like we're in it. And if you, the one sort of unifying factor that you can see across many of the different factions that are warring with each other is that everyone is basically supporting Palestine. So there's a huge reservoir of support. Obviously, the 1967 Arab League meeting, Khartoum meeting 3 No's, was one of the most notable meetings there of the history of the Arab League in opposition to the Israeli apartheid project. So ultimately, a democratic Sudan actually might create a more durable, more deeply rooted pro-Palestinian reality in sort of the politics of the country. And the West has always tried to prevent that. They've bombed Sudan many times. They've sanctioned Sudan, all these other things. So that's a big challenge. The Gulf states were very concerned because the Bashir government, while having some positive positions on Palestine, was just selling the land off to these big money people in the Arab world who were taking over all the agricultural land in order to export the agricultural products and make huge amounts of money to it, and destroying the livelihood of the farmers of Sudan, increasing food insecurity in Sudan, increasing the challenges with climate change with the way that they were doing the various different forms of farming. And then you also have the IMF World Bank, of course, which is in there controlling the economy of Sudan. And you've got these people who now want to like kick them out of the broader reality in Sudan. So there's a lot of problems for powerful people. So what they did is they decided to try to short circuit this uprising. And to short circuit the uprising, what they did is they created this civilian government. They basically got a section of the military to get rid of Bashir and say, we'll send him to the ICC. And, you hate him, the West, you hate him. So we'll let you take him and do what you want to do there. And then we will partner as the military, the section of the military that was willing, because the really National Congress Party, heavy based on the military, we will partner with like the most pro-Western elements of the democratic movement, this uprising that happened in 2019, and create kind of like a fake democratic government. And that's exactly what they did. And so fast forward to what happens with the civil war that started taking place there in 2021 is you have the elements in the military, both the SAF and the RSF that are fighting each other, decided, now fighting each other, decided, well, you know what? Look, why do we even have this fake fig leaf of these civilians? Like, why don't we just take over the government, do it for ourselves, especially because even though this sort of fig leaf of a civilian government was just that, they were doing various different things, trying to claw back some of the government-controlled entities in the economy and kind of hurting the privileged economic position of the military. So it was hurting them in a way. So they figured, why don't we just get rid of this? I think the West will probably be fine with it. We normalized with Israel, which no one in our country wanted. Generally, we're favorable to the IMF and the World Bank. We got rid of Bashir. So we can probably mount a coup, totally take over, and everything will be fine. So they do mount a coup. They do totally take over. Everything is not fine. The West and the Gulf states who are really kind of manipulating this thing are not happy with that because the world has seen this huge mass uprising, and especially the United States and Europe don't want to be seen as backing like a quote unquote dictatorship because, of course, their entire discourse is freedom and democracy, freedom and democracy, freedom and democracy. They've set this whole thing up to make it look like they're backing freedom and democracy. Now it looks bad. So then things become a little bit more complicated. The two sides of the military, basically the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces fall out against one another and then start a war against each other because both feel that they should have total control over the country, total control over the resources of the country, total control over the economy, and be the main interlocutor with all the international forces. So it's a long story in a way to come around to the fact that it's always presented in just kind of like two sides in Sudan fighting. But the whole reason that we are here is because instead of the broad mass movement of millions of Sudanese people that was erupting in 2019, that wanted to change the country in a way that whatever the difference is, you had a pretty broad consensus of people in the country wanted to see some of these basic changes take place. If that process had let itself play out, we likely would not be here right now. The country would probably be considered a beacon around the world of how young people in Africa are taking back their wealth and resources. Probably would have been a country that would have been standing up strongly in a way that would have been powerful against this ongoing genocide in Palestine, or, and all these different other factors that would have, I think, opened up the political space. It would have been something totally different than now. But because the West decided that they wanted to short circuit this huge mass uprising and establish their own power base to keep Sudan under their control, they set the stage for these two elements of the military and other elements of the elites to have this falling out and for it to lead to a civil war.